Those are my. Ya, yo no podía más con mi vida. O sea, era tan fun. No, es que literalmente estaba como que mi batería se desconoce. Como que en el ya, se acabó. Ya, I'm like, I just got it. So, consulting. Talking. In New York.
Sure. We have the next one.
You didn't have any interview, so shut up, please. What's the I went to the BCG one.
But enjoy like that.
Should have done more time.
Right?
Okay, California. They didn't get any. Oh, so good. Isn't that crazy? Crazy. I think you might get out. I think I'll just take it out. It's kind of weird because like when you're in New York, but I feel like I can't wait for them to come to this. Yeah. I think it's really strong. I think it's
I'm so excited.
Thank
you so much.
I always look into
No, I think that's pretty good. Yeah. It's like 3 or 4 hours. Thank you.
No, I'm. No, I. We should come with it.
My best work. Some.
The US Open is so fun. You should try to go.
You know, what's.
Wait, you should go to the beginning stages, and that's when you get really lucky with like kind of really cool things. And it's pretty cheap.
I was, so one of my friends. Yeah.
Last year. I went to.
When you go.
It's not there, so I need like way too much.
He's a secret. And then good shit. Which one is?
Hold on. It's,
I'm playing. And then I'm really.
okay. Yeah. Okay, got it.
We met those. Well, I'm sorry. It was. But he's one who posted it. This is recommended super. I was like.
Amazing.
Oh. Oh. No, actually, I got a couple times when we started. It was super. Mhm. So, like, yeah. You put up, they put like 10 minutes or.
Good to go. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming, and thanks also to those watching the live stream. And if you don't know, I'm Luigi Alex, I'm the Faculty Director at the Center, and we're very happy to host Supreme Week for a two-day mini course on capitalism with Indian characteristics, examining the unique features that characterize capitalism in India today. Thank you, Supreme, for joining us, and we look forward to your insights. Today's topic is the state, analyzing the formal political institutions that underpin India's economy. And Thursday's lecture will be on society to explore how past kinship and religious networks shape business in India. So please be sure to join us again on Thursday. This event is part of our meeting code series, where we host leading and rising scholars and experts from different fields for seminars on cutting-edge ideas not typically included in the standard curriculum. Feel free to check our website for more details as well as our application for market.com. Also remember to subscribe to our Capitalism podcast that I co-host with Bethany McLean. In this forthcoming Thursday episode, we will take a look at controlling AI systems in light of the recent breakthrough in DeepSeek. Back to today, before we start, please note that we are on the record, live streaming, and we will post the event video on our YouTube channel later. For those in the room, if you have any questions for Supreet, we will have time at the end. Please wait for the microphone before speaking so that everybody can enjoy your questions. As usual, views expressed by guests are their own, not those of the Peter Center or the University of Chicago. Now, please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker. Supreet is currently a PhD candidate in political science and MIT, specializing in political economy and quantitative methods, and is joining London Business School as an assistant professor. Supreet studies business and politics in emerging economies and is writing a dissertation, Essays on Business and Politics in India, about family firms in India. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Supreet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Luigi. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It is truly a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking at the Stigler Center, which is, the home for inquiry into state and markets, and broadly at U Chicago, which is, has a storied tradition of research on India's political economy, actually. So I'm going to start by just setting the stage by sharing some facts that I think all of you probably already know, and just to confirm that you are in the right room. So India, we're talking about India. India is the largest country in the world. We sort of already know that. It's also, it's growing, so we have millions of Indians joining the workforce every year, hungry for opportunity. India is also one of the fastest growing large economies in the world as well. One of the fastest growing stock markets, the fourth largest stock market in the world. And at this current moment, it stands at a pretty geopolitically advantageous position as well, with crosswinds coming in from east and west. And so India hopes to benefit from those sort of changing crosswinds. And so the global business and investor community is sort of paying increasing attention to India. And I think over the next 25 years, that trend is likely to just continue. And so it behooves us to maybe take some time to think about what actually makes the Indian economy tick. So what's the plan for the talk? What's the plan for the next couple of sessions? Let me start by telling you what this talk is not going to be about. It's not going to be a sales pitch. It's not going to be, this is not, I've not been sent by Invest India. I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be sort of giving you an advertisement to invest in India. I'm not going to be giving you stock tips, although if you have any, I would love to hear them. I'm also not going to be giving you a sort of current Indian market outlook, like what are the challenges and opportunities on the horizon for the Indian economy right now. It's also not a survey of the Indian economy or sort of like Indian politics that way. So what is it? Instead, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to sort of invite you to join me in taking an institutional lens, an institutional approach to understand the Indian economy. And so the specific question that I'm going to be focusing on is, what does business need to know when they're thinking about the institutions that undergird India's political economy? And we should take a pause here and think about what exactly does an institutional lens really mean? So you guys are perhaps familiar with this, but earlier this past year in 2024, these three gentlemen won the Nobel Prize in economics. This included a professor at U Chicago, James Robinson, and their work highlights the role of institutions in determining countries' long-run prosperity and long-run development outcomes. Institutions matter is the sort of meme version, which I'm sure you guys have all seen on Twitter. I'm sorry, X. It's a good meme, but it's a bit of an empty statement because one, it doesn't really tell us how institutions matter, or indeed what specifically those institutions are. And so that is sort of the project that we would like to put some meat on. So let's start by asking the question, what are institutions? Here's the definition. Institutions are rules of the game in a society. This comes from Douglas North, another Nobel Prize winning economist, sort of one of the pioneers of the work on sort of institutions and economics. When we think about rules of the game, what we're thinking about is sort of the real effective rules of the game, not simply like what is on the paper, but what is actually, the formal but also informal rules that dictate how, how an economy operates. And so these rules may be formal, may be informal, but they dictate what we can expect to see in an economy. So political economists are really interested in describing the political or the social rules that might be at play here. And it helps us figure out why countries might take sort of divergent paths in their development. So just as one example, there's a field of research called varieties of capitalism. This might be sort of Greek, but in the world of political economy, which I inhabit, varieties of capitalism sort of has a pretty strong niche out there. And so in the variety of capitalism literature, we tend to think about, what are the sort of key institutions that drive different sort of economies? One thing that we say is that the United States tends to be a bit of a market-oriented economy, and it's called a liberal market economy. Germany, on the other hand, is known to be more of what is called a coordinated market economy, where you have sort of a lot of collective decision-making between that take place at the industrial level. And so why is this useful? This is useful because you can explain phenomena that happen in contemporaneous time. So in 2020, in March of 2020, there was a pandemic unemployment crisis. Firms facing deep uncertainty about the future decided to lay off workers. It forced the United States to introduce a payment protection plan, amongst other things as well. What you'll notice, though, is that this is not the case of what you can see in the German case. And the reason for this is that due to the collective bargaining agreements between labor associations and employer associations, Germany has historically had what is known as these short-term work policies, where when companies face hard times, instead of laying off workers, it simply reduces their hours. And so you really do not see the same kind of spike in unemployment that you see in America as you saw in Germany. And that is explained, it's sort of a lot of people were kind of scratching their heads wondering what's happening in Germany, what's the silver bullet? Well, the answer is actually in the institutional features that exist that predate the crisis itself. And so I hope I've convinced you that it is useful to think about institutions in understanding how countries operate and what happens in an economy. And so then the question that we're going to be answering today is, well, what institutions matter for capitalism in India? In 2019, Professor Raghuram Rajan, also at the Booth School, published this book, and it's about the three pillars in society: market, state, and community. I actually got a chance to get this book signed when he came to give a talk at the company I was working at before grad school. This is almost exactly 5 years ago, just before I got into grad school, which is very exciting. His argument was that the state, that the state and the market are basically running roughshod over community. It's sort of on the title of the cover of the book itself. You don't have to look that far. I'm not going to debate the argument, but I am going to borrow those three key actors: the market, the state, and the community. And what I'm going to say is that the rules of the market are actually produced by the rules of the state and of the community. And so today I'll be talking about the state, and on Thursday we'll be talking about the community. And so, what are the key institutional features of the Indian state that might shape how markets in India operate? I'm going to highlight three sort of aspects of the Indian state that I think businesses ought to pay attention to when they're thinking about India's political economy and doing business in India. I'm going to be talking about the federal structure of India's economy, of India's administrative federalism. I'm going to be talking about the sort of vibrant elections that we have known to sort of know about India. And I'm going to talk about what we call the steel frame of India, which is the bureaucracy. Okay, so let's start with federalism. India is a very large country. It is divided in approximately 36 subnational territories. I say approximately because it's sort of states and union territories, but it's fine. About 36 subnational territories or states. And just given the size of the country, the size of each of these subnational territories are itself the size of large countries. You know, if you talk to any development economist, they've run some RCTs in Uttar Pradesh. A lot of them have done that. And they will tell you Uttar Pradesh is the size of Brazil, which is correct. But there are a lot of other countries as well, which are also the size of very respectable country sizes. And this is just subnational territories of India. Like a lot of other very large countries, India is sort of administratively divided into a federalized structure. And what that means is that each state has its own legislative and executive branches of government, responsible for decision-making, administrative decision-making. This is much like the United States. So when you have many independent states, what you get is a form of competitive federalism. And this tends to be good for business. And so specifically, when you think about, the same way that, Texas might offer tax subsidies or some kind of incentives to bring businesses to move from one part of the country to relocate to Texas, the same thing happens in India where individual states might jockey for businesses to relocate and move to a particular jurisdiction or kick some businesses out because of some particular political persuasion. So, for instance, yes, so that's right. States compete for business. In 2007, Tata Motors tried to launch a factory to build the world's cheapest car, the Tata Nano. And they were initially planned to build a plant in West Bengal. Due to, that was sort of politically toxic for the moment. And so then Gujarat came in, and it was literally over SMSs to, text messages to the I guess the heads of Tata Motors that they actually were able to persuade the company to move to the Ahmedabad district instead. And this is the kind of sort of competitive federalism that you can see happening in India. And you don't have to go that far, or maybe if you would like to go that far, you can actually go to Davos. And what you'll notice is that individual states in India actually have their own delegation out there. So you can see the beautiful Swiss village on the side, and then you have Tamil Nadu just advertising, and then Maharashtra down the street or something. So there is really a sense of competitive federalism. So great, as a business, that's fantastic, right? It's also not unique per se. This kind of competitive federalism is something that you've come to expect when you have a federalist kind of system. The unique feature about India's federalism is that the competition is not just between states, but actually between states and the central government as well. And so what I'm calling this is sort of like a state-center tug of war, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, State governments and national governments are actually responsible for very clearly demarcated, distinct sets of issues. And it's sort of spelt out in the Constitution. There's the union list, which is the central, like national list. There's the state list. There's the concurrent list. That is sort of like joint jurisdiction. These are explicit. They say explicitly what each level of government is responsible for. And yet, there's always been this sort of pull to centralize. Not to put too fine a point on the numbers of items on this list, I just gave you a few examples here. But since independence to now, the number of items on the state list has gone down, and the number of items on the union list and the concurrent list has gone up. And it just sort of gives you a flavor of this sort of constant pull to centralize with occasional pushes to devolve to the federal level. Shruti Rajagopalan at the Mercatus Center, along with some of her co-authors, they actually call this centripetal federalism, which I think is a pretty good analogy and metaphor for what is actually going on. So we can actually just talk about it a little bit more. Where does that actually come from? Why do we have this sort of push-pull between centralization and devolution? So in the Constitution of India actually defines the country as a federal system with a unitary bias. And so in doing so, it kind of gives us a bit of a founding contradiction. Now, at the time of independence, there was a sort of a need for this. India was dealing with a monumental monumental scale of intergroup violence and unrest. One of the largest population transfers of ever in history took place between India and a newly formed Pakistan. Religious fervor was at a peak. Princely states were deciding if they wanted to enter the union or not. Under these sort of very volatile and choppy conditions, the Constituent Assembly and the founding parents felt it was prudent to actually give the central government outsized powers to maintain peace and harmony, make sure that the union actually survives. This power was actually quickly misused. So one of the powers was actually the power to be able to dismiss the state governments. This is enshrined in Article 356 with the idea that if regions of India are creating trouble, the central government can simply go in, dismiss that government, replace with their own, and thereby maintain the peace. Between 1952 and 2019, this power was invoked approximately 100 times or so. And so you can kind of tell that this was being misused. Specifically, there's some interesting work which goes into why this was actually happening, and it's really not about keeping the peace as much as sort of being retributive to political rivals. So a lot of opposition parties have been removed under the guise of sort of keeping the peace. And so this is the kind of power that is enshrined in the central government, which is oftentimes misused. Now, on the other hand, there have been some moves to devolve power as well. So in the 1990s, actually, there was a lot happening. There was a sort of a broader liberalization of the economy, along which there was a wave of devolution. So you had constitutional amendments that both created and empowered local political bodies. You had finance commissions actually recommending increasing disbursement of funds to state governments for spending. And the Supreme Court ruling actually tried to halt the practice of, without warrant, dismissing state governments around the country. And so the 1990s and 2000s were actually a period of pretty significant devolution. But the pendulum swings both ways. And so, and today, with greater political concentration in the hands of the dominant party, the BJP, this has actually coincided with a lot of greater centralization in the hands of the union government in general. And so you can actually see this with taxation. State governments are responsible for roughly 60% of overall government spending in India. But only receives about 40% of tax receipts in India. And with recent sort of centralization of the tax system with this thing called the GST, the goods and services tax, over the last 10 years or so, you've actually seen increasing sort of revenues accruing to the center and then sort of being dispersed to the states. So when you have this gap between state spending and state revenue collection, well, the shortfall needs to be made up somehow. States can borrow, but there's just not very well developed municipal sort of lending markets. And instead, what states rely on is the central government to disperse grants basically to cover that difference. this is the opportunity for the central government to exercise some large amount of discretion. So yes, there are formulas and rules, but on the other hand, we know that after the 2024 election that just happened last year, the BJP came back to power, but requiring outside support from political parties from Andhra Pradesh and Bihar. And lo and behold, the next budget that is sort of announced, the central government apportions a disproportionate amount of spending to those two states. And then much to the chagrin, of course, to other states who then sort of, send delegations to Delhi to demand sort of a more fair allocation of resources and really are facing the risk of not being able to meet their spending promises. A lot of elections in India are fought on spending promises around the world, certainly, but also in India. So the takeaway from what do businesses need to know about India's federalism? Well, the first thing is there are levels to the Indian state. We tend to think about, if you crack open the page of The Economist, we'll read about like what's happening in India, but you'll forget the fact that there are 36 parts of India, each the size of countries who have their dedicated section in the same Economist magazine. So keep an eye out for different levels of government. It's important to recognize what level of government you as a business are actually interfacing with. But keep in mind that the promises of one level of government may actually be constrained by another level of government in the form of taxation that we just talked about. Okay, so moving on to the second, which is elections. So I'm going to talk about three aspects of elections: how it increases volatility, the role of campaign finance, and what like turnovers are at stake. So we know a lot about elections already. Huge sort of democratic jamborees, multiple political parties representing all sorts of different political persuasions. Every 5 years or so, we get to say things like largest election in history. Which is true, but people do say that. It's just the demographics, but it is quite fun every year. It's the largest this time. And it is truly, it is quite a spectacle of administrative prowess, actually. It's multiple phases. It takes about 6 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks to actually complete an election because you sort of need to physically move security personnel from one part of the country to the next just to administer it safely. It is really quite an exercise. And so we know this. What does business need to know about elections in India? So let me make a couple of points. The first one is you have national elections, but you also have state elections. And the state elections are actually staggered, which means that in any given year, India is always having elections. And that brings with it, all the sort of the chaos, commotion, the campaigning that elections, honestly, like a festival of elections, some might call it that, take place every single year. So I've just highlighted here, like some of the national election years in the black bar, which you'll notice that each state is sort of going to election every time. So just last week, Delhi completed its polls. Bihar will be going next, and there's a lot sort of happening. So if you are a business with, pan-India operations, you're sort of always exposed to electioneering. So what else do we need to know? Well, the second thing is elections are expensive in India. So the Center for Media Studies, it's a nonprofit in India, it recently estimated that about $16 billion was spent on the last 2024 elections. This is almost double that was spent in the 2019 elections, and actually eclipses what was spent in the American elections in 2020 as well. Elections in India are very, very expensive. And to fund these elections, parties rely on donations. This is, again, very similar to the United States model, where politicians we kind of know spend most of their day just fundraising. I mean, you can look at your phones and you will know that they are fundraising. So very similarly, in India, politicians and political parties are also busy fundraising. The difference between the American case and the Indian case, however, is that the marginal donor to campaign finance in America is actually the individual. It's you and me. Whereas in India, it's not typically an individual, it is businesses. And so businesses are actually the marginal donor to elections in India, to campaign finance in India, as opposed to the United States. And this actually has material consequences for businesses as well. So Devesh Kapoor and Milan Vaishnav, Devesh Kapoor, who's my advisor, wonderful advisor, they have a very interesting paper which actually looks at the cement prices around election times. And it's very fascinating. Basically, the months of just leading into an election, cement prices drop. And the reason that they find is that construction companies are basically reallocating their operational expenses, sort of buying construction, whatever, buying cement, and actually, sort of reallocating that to party finance and, campaign finance operations. And so you can clearly tell this is materially consequential for a construction company. We know that. The question is, well, are there returns to this behavior as well? Do these companies benefit or not? This is an interesting question. I think our instinct is probably yes, surely there's like a pay-to-play quid pro quo at play over here. And certainly if you look at a lot of the journalistic accounts, there's tons of very almost fascinating, actually very fascinating cases of companies sort of being lavishly rewarded with government procurement contracts or something like that. But systematic evidence is a little bit more murky. So this is actually some work that I have actually done, which I'm like trying to understand what happens if a company makes a donation to a political party that comes to power. What do they actually receive in return? It's not very clear. There isn't great systematic evidence to suggest that there are great returns for these kinds of investments, if you want to call them that. Again, this is actually very similar to the American story. Again, we have an instinct that there's a lot of quid pro quo politics at play, but the systematic evidence does not really show that. There could be, of course, I'm not trying to say there isn't. It is hard to prove a negative, and also there are so many design choices when you're looking for systematic evidence. So I would not put too fine a point on that, but just to say that we know that businesses are being asked to pay for these elections. Are they getting something in return? We don't know. Yes.
Should we have a model where in mind that the businesses are investing over a portfolio of parties, or they're going all in on one, or how are they allocating their resources?
That's actually my dissertation paper. So I'm very happy to talk about that.
Excellent question.
Yeah, excellent, fantastic question. Yeah, so I think we tend to think in the American context that businesses are using a portfolio strategy, and you can compare that to individuals, where individuals tend to be sort of like ideologically motivated or something like that. In the Indian context, I actually don't find evidence for that. I find most businesses actually tend to sort of go all in on one party. And the reason for that I argue, is that most businesses in India are actually family businesses. And so there's a commingling of actually the personal wallet and like your personal pocketbook and the company's balance sheet. And so when you actually look for non-family businesses in India, they actually are taking a more portfolio approach. And so that is the sort of, so yes, I would say that for non-family businesses that look a lot more like the American businesses that we see here, you do see a portfolio approach, but yeah.
Do they benefit from any kind of tax break, or is there a reason they're giving through their business and not just giving through their personal?
Yes, there are tax benefits to sort of, in order to take money away from the black money sort of briefcase politics and to turn it into, I guess, like white money disclosed, they were incentivized with tax breaks. So there's an incentive for individuals, if you have an LLC or some kind of private limited corporation at your disposal, you're incentivized to sort of give through the white money channel. That's right. Thank you for the question. Okay, so now that's the second point. Elections are expensive, and we do not know for sure what companies are getting out of it. The third thing is that elections cause uncertainty. We kind of know this. Actually, for a few years before I started grad school, I used to work on an emerging markets debt trading desk. And maybe 80% of the investor committee meetings were basically spent on discussing what was going to happen in the next upcoming election around the world. And the question, therefore, is, what's at stake when you have this sort of like election uncertainty? A natural instinct is to think that policy is at stake. So what happens if a left-wing or a right-wing government comes to power? You might have some expectation of what happens to tax rates or something like that. And sort of this kind of like dictates what you can expect from policy moving forward. What I'm going to tell you, though, is that I'm going to suggest that policy is actually less at stake in Indian elections as much as people uncertainty. So I'm going to make this point in a few different ways. So one, there is an active debate about, there's a big sort of scholarly debate about whether ideology matters at all in Indian politics. So are voters even aware of big policy questions, and sort of do they vote on it, basically? So in the 1990s, you had sort of a pretty mammoth economic structural change with liberalization that took place in the early 1990s following a balance of payment crisis. And yet, when polled, a majority of Indians had no idea that that was even happening. The people in this camp who believe that sort of there is no ideology in Indian politics, what do they believe? What are the fundamental structures of Indian politics? They would argue that it's identity. So we're going to talk more about this on Thursday, but when you have a multi-ethnic polity with sort of like, driven by differences, you sort of have political parties that come to represent those identities more so than ideologies. And so then if you believe that, then it makes sense that there actually is not that much sort of ideology at play and sort of policy prescriptions at play, and it's more a question of like identity and representation. So some people would say there is no ideology. So then, of course, you don't have policy uncertainty because there's no ideology like at stake over here with one party coming to power and the other. Some people refuse that and say that there is in fact ideology in Indian politics, but there's generally there's a general acceptance that the terms of the ideological debate is not on your classic sort of left-right on economic welfarism or tax rates, pro-business thinking or something like that. Instead, it tends to be more about sort of minority inclusion and sort of minority majoritarianism and the role of the state in sort of bridging the differences between minorities and majorities. So there's some fantastic work. I think I would recommend Rahul Verma and Pradeep Chibber's book on this topic. Okay, so if we think that economic policy is not at stake, I guess the question is what is at stake? And I'm arguing that it is not a policy, it's personnel. And the reason, I should actually add one more point, which is one other way that you can kind of tell that policies are not particularly at stake is that you have a lot of party switching. I think it's a little bit rare to think about Democrats who move to Republicans and like Republicans who become Democrats. I think you see them occasionally and they are sort of like noteworthy for that reason. But, I think a couple of elections ago, I saw a statistic that said about over 16% of elected members of parliament were sort of like previously members of of another party. In fact, it just happened right now in Delhi where the Congress party won 0 seats, but former Congress party politicians are very well represented in the Legislative Assembly. And so there's a lot of party switching. And if that's the case, then you almost think that ideology is not at stake even for these politicians when they are entering politics in the first place. So all that is sort of a counter to the case that policy is at stake. I'm making the point that personnel is actually at stake. And the way I can sort of make that point is by telling you that incumbents in India, actually face an electoral disadvantage. Again, that sort of departs from, I think, what our expectations are about the incumbency advantage and how sort of you have the bully pulpit to sort of make your case much more strongly than any opposition leader might have. But actually, in the Indian context, incumbents tend to sort of face disadvantage. And again, when you're operating in a multi-party environment rather than a simple, two-party environment, you actually don't know who. Okay, let's say we know the incumbent is going to lose. You don't really know who's going to come to power because there's sort of like a menu of options in front of you. And so for that reason, elections in India, I'm going to argue, are actually more about personnel turnover risk more so than policy turnover risk. Okay, so what are the takeaways for businesses if you're thinking about elections? Well, elections are incessant. They will always be there. And they actually kind of have material costs to how your business operates as well. When you are thinking about what's at stake at these elections, I would argue that who's coming to power matters perhaps more than what you think they might do ex ante, because we actually really don't know what they might do ex ante. Okay, so for the final part of the session on the state, I'm going to talk about the bureaucracy. So in the first two parts, federalism and elections, I've talked about how these are institutions and features that promote a volatility. So if you're doing business in India, you should get ready for some volatility. What I'm going to tell you now is that the bureaucracy actually acts as a bit of an antidote to that. It actually acts as an institution of continuity, as opposed to the volatility that comes from federalism and elections. So, we're very, very proud of the Indian bureaucracy. It's called the steel frame, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the bureaucracy is in the news these days. In the United States, when the president comes to power, there's sort of a wholesale turnover of senior government leadership, and it's because the senior officials in the American administrative state, they serve at the pleasure of the president. So that means they sort of like have a turnover when there is an electoral turnover as well. That's not the case in India. You have a permanent civil service, permanent civil servants who, the bureaucracy is designed to be permanent. Officials have tenure, structured promotion system, and the idea is, it's at least in theory, is supposed to make them insulated from political interference. So yes, as I was saying, India is very proud of its bureaucrats, and they occupy a very high esteem. There's a very competitive examination to sort of enter the Indian Administrative Service. Now, I should say, though, that this is perhaps a little bit biased. I come from a family with a long line of bureaucrats, and so perhaps it's just high esteem for me, and perhaps you don't think so. But at least the lore around it is that this institution, this is the steel frame. It was the sort of leftover of like the British, colonial state to rule the country, and now it has been repurposed to sort of help the state run. And we're very, very proud of it. But because of its sort of permanent features and its sort of like independent operations, it is sort of, if you're a business, you sort of need to pay attention to the bureaucracy as a sort of a uniquely, as a unique institution that also operates in the political environment. So you have the political parties, you have the politicians, but you need to pay attention to the bureaucrats because they have their independent logics and how they operate. So let me just take a few minutes to talk about how the bureaucracy matters for business, and it matters in two ways. So one, the bureaucracy is the regulatory arm of the state. Its job is to actually just execute policies. But in India, the bureaucracy does much more than that. So it also plays a de facto role in making policy. So these two roles, executor of policy and maker of policy, both of these things matter for how businesses operate. So talking first about the role of bureaucracy in executing policy. One thing we talk a lot about is state capacity, which is the ability of the government to get things done. Scholars, journalists, we talk a lot about the inability of the Indian state to actually deliver routine services well. I was just in India like last week, and I was talking to some manufacturers in Madhya Pradesh, and they were complaining about how they sort of like needed permission from 15 different sets of people in order to expand their business. And what does it mean to have 15 sets of sort of permissions? Well, it means 15 sets of veto points and opportunities for people to hold up the permission structure to actually then prevent businesses to actually move forward. We talk about the great unease of doing business in India. This sort of comes from, there's red tape all around in the system. Where does this come from? Well, part of the issue is actually a story of overburdened regulators. So India has, compared to the size of the population, India has fewer government employees per capita than, sort of similar countries, Brazil, China. I mean, you can see the graph up here. You actually have, it's actually a story of bureaucrats being rather overburdened compared to, and I think if you were to talk to Indians, they might say, oh, these lazy bureaucrats. But actually the story is a little bit different. It's actually a bunch of bureaucrats who are overworked. And so they're not able to get to all the tasks that they need to get to. And that is actually causing some of the issues and the red tape and the delays when you're thinking about, permissioning and things like that. Now, it's not just about the numbers. Even when bureaucrats have, the authority and the ability, their goals are sometimes a bit unclear. So we're moving now from the executing of policy to the making of policy. But, sort of even in theory, when when they are sort of, even if they are implementing policies that have been set by elected leaders, they often do have a much greater discretion and ability to shape policies on the ground. And I'm going to talk about some of those now. So as a director of policy, I'm going to talk about it at sort of two different levels. So politicians and legislators actually play a much more limited role in shaping policy. And instead, bureaucrats have a lot of discretion and influence. So one way they actually have this is actually at the ground level. So when you're a recently trained inductee into the Indian Administrative Service, you're actually sent as a district collector in districts that have the average size of a district in India is about 1 million people. And sort of you are, call it like a 24-year-old, 25-year-old person, fresh out of the training academy, and now you are the most important single government official in a population of about 1 million people, and you're in charge of law and order, local government, land administration, disaster management. Your choice of how you spend your time actually has policy implications. It is actually a statement of policy prioritization, how you manage your time. And in some real sense, that is making policy. But even, away from the sort of like more practical nature, like a little more like at the upper echelons as well, at the national level, so Stanley Kochenek is a political economist from Penn State, used to be a political economist at Penn State, done a lot of work on business and politics in India, and he has this very striking line in which he says that throughout the post-independence period, major changes in Indian economic policies are usually initiated by a small technocratic group of elite within the bureaucracy and with the support of key political leaders. Bureaucrats actually have a lot of power and ability to shape high-level policymaking in the Indian state as well. So it's instructive, just to like take a look at, the trade liberalization that I've sort of remarked at a couple of times in this talk already. But so Douglas Irwin, he's an economic historian at Dartmouth. He sort of put out a paper on this and sort of really documents the process through which how India dismantled what was called like the license Raj that predated economic liberalization in the 1990s. And it's very instructive to note the role of key bureaucrats in the finance ministry who actually played a role in building consensus that economic change was necessary even before the crisis happened. And in fact, actually developed a playbook, and it was called the M document, which actually sort of had a list of prescriptions of policy changes that when a crisis took place, they were actually able to move immediately. And this was really the interests of this small group of technocratic elites in the bureaucracy who had a particular interest in a certain set of policies and saw the opportunity and took them. Now, this is great because we like trade liberalization. India certainly took off, as sort of an economic growth engine, after sort of decades of sort of stagnant growth. But the thing to maybe zoom out and think about is, wow, how lucky were we that we had the right types of bureaucrats at the right place at the right time? That leads to a level of volatility where you might also have the wrong types of bureaucrats at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so a way to think about it, as a structure and a framework. So Peter Evans is a sociologist, and he was interested in understanding what sort of bureaucratic configurations might help explain why certain economies exploded in sort of their like post-World War II economic growth. So this is like your Asia success stories, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. And his interest was understanding what is the role of the state in helping these sort of like high growth stories. And he sort of focuses on the bureaucracy. And his idea was that there are sort of two dimensions, embeddedness and autonomy. And you sort of want to be at the sweet spot where you're sort of like not too embedded, but not too not embedded, and not too autonomous, and not autonomous at all. And so what do those words mean? So embeddedness has to do with integration with the stakeholders that you are sort of in communication with. And autonomy is simply the ability and the agency to sort of make these important decisions. If you are completely integrated, that's actually, if you are completely integrated with no autonomy, you are simply making the decisions of someone else. And if you are completely integrated with, let's say, the business community as a bureaucrat, a regulator of those businesses, this is a story of capture. This is a story of rent seeking. his diagnosis of the Indian case was that the Indian bureaucrat suffered from being not embedded enough. So there were not enough points of communication between bureaucrats, important decision makers, and the population and the business community at large, but a lot of autonomy. And so I've shown you how much autonomy they do have to sort of like discretionarily guide policy. The question is, are they sort of like in sync with the population that they are actually making policies for? So the takeaway here, and then we'll move on to like the final slide. The takeaway here for businesses when thinking about the bureaucracy is, in a world of volatility, the bureaucracy can actually be a source of continuity. That said, low capacity and high discretion can actually be the key risks. So just to summarize, in this talk here, we've focused on the state and how the rules of the state affect the rules of the market of Indian capitalism. And I've sort of just boiled it down to a simple few things for businesses to keep in mind when you're thinking about the federal nature of the government, when you're thinking about the volatile nature of elections, and when you're thinking about the continuous but high volatility strategy of dealing with bureaucrats. So I'll stop there and take any questions. And thank you. Yes, hi. Can I get your...
First of all, thank you so much for the session. This was really insightful. So one of the news I was trying to follow these days was one nation, one election. So if we just talk about all the things you talk, especially in the federalism and election section, how do you think like if eventually one nation, one election comes up, do you think like parties will fund more in that particular election and like companies will fund more in that particular election, or like something will change? Because typically when they are like trying to get some benefits out of it, and if they're doing it at a larger scale, they will get some ADCBI, some sort of rates. In the smaller election, they are still saved, like company are putting money in any particular political party. So they didn't get caught in doing that. But on the national level election, when there will be only one election for all the different stages of the government, how do you think it will impact the way company funds the election campaigns?
No, I think that's a good question. So just for context, if you guys already are aware, but there's a proposal in the works, sort of in the intellectual sphere, about one nation, one election, which is just to say that we're electioneering all the time. Let's maybe just do it like once, and then like 5 years ago, like do it again, right? So like all the states will sort of have elections in one time. So this is the one nation, one election idea. So that idea is interesting. I think there are a lot of like that would be. I think that would quite change the nature, like institutional nature of the structure of the economy. I think a key way that would affect things is actually by undermining the story of competitive federalism that we were talking about. So one thing that we kind of know is that when you do have concurrent elections, and there actually are a few states which do have their local election, their state elections at the same time as the national elections, and what you kind of see is that there's a bleeding into sort of the opinions or like how the national government votes. The national government vote in that constituency tends to sort of have an impart on how that constituency also then votes for the state election. So there's an interest in, I guess, muddling those two issue sets, which is something that like happens there. So I think you end up undermining the story of competitive federalism when you undermine the independence, so to speak, of these states. What will that do to campaign finance? I'm not sure. But my suspicion is that when you do have this story of competitive federalism, what you end up having, I think, is a story of local sort of power centers. And then, you know, if we believe that truly everything is a game of crony capitalism, then you have businesses sort of making investments to the sort of like the local people that matter. But if now everything is sort of consolidated into like, you know, if you're undermining federalism and centralizing the electoral structure, I think it means that you end up sort of centralizing the campaign finance structure as well. And I think what happens is you end up having a few really big players kind of calling all the shots, which is something that you're actually seeing now at the central government level. Yeah, that would be my suggestion. Luigi.
I know that India has a very complicated relation with the past colonial legacy of the UK, but I'm surprised to say that they are so proud of their bureaucracy following the British bureaucracy, because the British bureaucracy was an imperial bureaucracy designed to basically control an enemy territory, kind of. And so the fact that the current bureaucracy is a direct legacy from that is not very reassuring for a democratic future of India, because it seems that it's almost like an element of repression over embeddedness or responding to stakeholders. And to what extent most of this bureaucracy is at the federal level, right? So my impression, but I know very little, so please feel free to. My impression is that it's a little bit like the European bureaucracy that is self-appointed to support the ideal of Europe, and in name of this superior ideal, does whatever it takes. It seems that India has this characteristic that is a very heterogeneous country. The only thing that keeps it together is actually the legacy of the UK, because the British Empire, because India is a creation of the British Empire, because before there was no India, there was an India subcontinent, but not an India country. And so this ideology of Indian whatever is what keeps it together. But please feel free to disagree.
No, I very much agree with you. I think the heralding of the Indian bureaucracy is one feature, but I think in smarter rooms, there's actually healthy discussion about whether we're simply taking an element of the colonial state and repurposing, saying that we're switching the purpose, but actually just continuing the same. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think even further, people have talked about how the Indian Constitution is in many ways just sort of taking a Government of India Act of 1930 or 35, which is sort of pre-independence, sort of like the rules for governing a colony have been repurposed and it seems sort of not really fit for purpose to run a full-fledged democratic polity. I can only agree with you, and I will also say that there are questions about what really makes the bureaucracy tick, especially in a country like India where post-liberalization, you have really great outside opportunities. Just thinking about sort of like the personal pocketbook economics of someone who is a high-achieving, high-test scoring person. Why are you sort of choosing to dedicate yourself to a bureaucracy which probably pays you less than you could go to the private sector? And there's something about a high-minded ideal that drives you to want to serve your nation. And that sort of sounds very good and appealing, but I agree with you. This is the story of lack of embeddedness, because what is actually your goal? We actually don't know. And I think bureaucrats act as a vehicle for continuity, but it's very scary because you don't really know what is the ideology of a bureaucrat. Yeah. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have two questions. First question is pretty quick. The first one is, you talked about how businesses in India kind of are the marginal donors when it comes to elections. Wouldn't that drive out new tech businesses, for example, or how do they kind of adjust that?
Okay. Do you want to hear your second question as well?
Yeah, the second question is specifically when you talked about the state, the federal level to the state level, policies or kind of distribution of funds are coming out. One thing that came out recently was a deep tech fund. I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It was announced for like $1 billion+ in deep tech startups. I talked to a Indian startup founder that I work with, and he said that, I can't get that grant unless I have a faculty advisor. And that's just basically the nature of what he said, how it works in India and when these big government grants come up for startups from the federal level. So if you could talk about that, that would be a second question.
Yeah, I think there are sort of like rules. So the tech sector is an interesting one. I think the tech sector, in many ways, the level of the state that it is interfacing with tends to be one not India at all. So if you are actually exporting your services to the international community, you're actually a little bit less exposed to the vagaries of your domestic politics. But insofar as you are, you're probably exposed to the federal government more so than state governments. Well, not entirely. If you want to set up your offices or something like that, like in like the Bangalore IT parks or something, then you are facing the Karnataka government. Yeah, I would say maybe for the second part, look, the federal government has a lot of arcane rules and strange rules, but I think like bureaucracies everywhere have sort of like rules, and you just have to check the box, as they say in the UK, computers say no, and then you just have to do that. But like I would say that from my data that I've put together on campaign donations, the tech sector tends to be underrepresented as investors in the campaign finance world. So roughly like whatever, like 8-10% of companies in India are sort of like in the IT bucket. Maybe much less of the share of companies that make donations to political parties. IT companies tend to be much less than that. Yeah, let me take a question here.
I also have two questions. One is really quick, that like I have seen a slide that you are mentioning like minority included like majoritarianism or something like that. I really want to know about that term. What does that term really mean? And the second question is like, I'm not an Indian. I came from Bangladesh and I'm a bureaucrat. So like in Bangladesh, we are like bureaucracy is like heavily, politicized. So like a single bureaucrat cannot do anything. I mean, they cannot formulate even the single policy by their own. They always have like political intervention. So like we also like, carrying the legacy of that British bureaucratic system, kind of like IAS type of system. So I'm interested to learn more about bureaucracy. Like, do they have that kind of same political intervention? Because they are some people like in our country also, like they sacrificed their like 6-digit salary or 7-digit salary just to get this kind of flavor of reputation or power, or like to get involved with direct policy formulation. But after joining the civil service, I found myself that we have like, very little space to independently formulate any policy. So is this the same case in India as well?
Yeah, I would say that you hear all. So it's a vast country, and you hear it all. I think the politicization of the bureaucracy is something that is happening. I think it goes in like waves. There was a period in the 90s, especially, where you had a lot of sort of like regulators who seemed very unburdened by the political whims. I think perhaps by the nature of the fact that you had coalitional governments in power. So I think it probably comes down to whether the political directives are concentrated and clear and sort of working in one direction. And if not, so in the 90s, you had sort of this coalition governments. It was very unclear who was the one most important politician, political leader, political party even. I think under those circumstances, you probably have greater discretion that is available to bureaucrats to actually, envision policy, things like that. But I can say, my dad was in the Foreign Service, and it seems like a lot of India's foreign policy comes with sort of spirited debate amongst the bureaucrats and diplomats who are actually sort of on the ground as well. So I do think there is actually a great opportunity for bureaucrats to exercise discretion. But I agree with you, like in the end, you are responding to the politician. So if the politician's directives are concentrated and clear, then you probably do not have as much discretion. If it's more diffuse and unconcentrated, you probably have greater discretion. Yeah, over here, thanks.
Thank you, Sukrit. Thank you, Sukrit, for such an engaging presentation. You mentioned earlier that the current version of the Constitution is a repurposed version of the older one, which was designed to rule a colony. Can you give an example, maybe, of any section from the Constitution which you feel is a derivation from something that's designed to rule a colony?
Yeah, sure. This is not my area of expertise. I can just recommend a bunch of podcasts that I've listened to, which are very interesting, in addition to Capitalism. So I think sedition so speaking out against the state is sort of is a criminal offense. And I think you can use that. And that is something that sort of comes out from, revolutionaries conspiring against the colonial state, which has sort of found its way to continue. Oh, what's that?
Speaking of.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And so this is something which I think really should not be in a, well, what do I know? But I think if I were designing a constitution for a free peoples, that seems to be a remnant of a prior purpose, which sort of like finds convenience if you are sort of, yeah. Yes.
So you go ahead.
You made reference to increasing outside options available to like the highest quality people. In my experience working in India has been very limited, but it's with the senior level IAS personnel have been spectacular,
Right,
in my
right.
experience. But we now, like the generation that really had an outside option, like a far dominant outside option, is just really coming into the professional
Yes.
sphere now. So is there good data on how that's affecting outcomes? And then at least on US side reporting, we've seen the New York Times did like a whole profile of the cities that are just full of people who spend up to a decade trying to pass the exam,
Yeah.
which I found to be like a horrifying loss of human capital. And so I just love to hear kind of what's happening with that and any aspect.
Oh yeah, I think there's something. It is absolutely fascinating. I actually know a number of people who sort of decided to just quit their jobs and spend 3 years studying and sort of just taking the examination over and over again. I think there's like some interesting work which actually shows how youth unemployment sort of is kept at a high level. It's sort of youth unemployment drops as soon as the age at which you are, like I think you have to sort of be like under 29 or under 30 basically to take this examination. So at that age afterwards, sort of like youth unemployment rates just sort of drop off because people are sort of classified as unemployed because they're just sort of like waiting for this examination. I think you have a changing demographic and nature of who is entering the civil services. A couple of things, like one, I guess, sort of like socioeconomically, because people who have the sort of English-speaking education and are able to sort of sell their human capital for getting a job at BCG or something, you would probably do that. But there's probably a lot of people who do not have that. So there's a sort of a socioeconomic story. But there's also a story of, cracking the examination. It's just a very difficult examination. It's sort of like, maybe like 2% like a pass rate or something. And India is really good at the elite levels of sort of like constructing these examinations that are very, very hard to pass. And the people who are really good at passing exams are sort of the people who enter these like STEM fields, like the Indian Institute of Technology, things like that. And so you're seeing a big shift in like the profiles of, if you look at like the majors or, like what the course of study that the sort of incoming bureaucrats did, 50 years ago versus today, it's sort of moved a lot away from political science, economics, history to, engineering, computer science, medicine, things like that. And so I'm sure there's an effect on what is happening sort of in the culture of the bureaucracy. I haven't seen great work on this, but I can tell you that this is sort of, again, my dad actually is sort of now he's retired, but he sort of does the interviews for people who are entering the civil services. And he has talked about this. I've spoken to a number of other people as well. Surely there's an effect. We don't know what that is, and I would be curious to, uncover that. If we still have time, I'm happy to keep taking questions. But...
One more question.
Okay.
And then we hope everyone will join us
Okay.
Thursday.
Can we have one more question here? Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for coming here. The pass percentage for the civil services examination is actually 0.005%. It's really hard. And also speaking of the bureaucracy, it's often said that the Indian state or like the Indian economy has grown not because of the bureaucracy, but despite it. It's a slow-moving elephant, doesn't take change very well. There's no domain expertise and all of that. As somebody who's grown up in like watching all of that and has studied it, I'm curious what you think about it.
I don't think that's very fair. People say that a lot. People also say that the state has no role in growth and everything. I see the institutions of the state as sort of being quite important. And I think we can point to examples like the 1990 economic liberalization of bureaucrats and technocrats within the bureaucracy who had an interest and a particular view of what changes needed to be made that went over and above. So if you actually look at what was happening in the 1990s balance of payment crisis, the IMF came in with a sort of an emergency loan, had some riders with it, but the kinds of policy reforms that the Indian state actually did went beyond the requirements of the IMF's sort of terms. And that was because they actually had a vision of what they actually wanted, what they thought the Indian economy needed to jumpstart, dynamism. And so I actually think, and in fact, there's a great website called the 1991 Project, which really looks at the role of key sort of diamonds in the rough, in a sense, of these bureaucrats who had the ability and the inclination to push these reforms forward. And I would say, look, there's probably lots of examples of bureaucrats who have stood in the way of great, factories and productive uses of time and money and capital. But there are also examples of bureaucrats who have paved the way for these kinds of things. It's two sides of the coin.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Yeah.